allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I've been around for a long, long year. Stole many a man's soul of faith. I was around when Jesus Christ had his moments of doubt and pain. Made damn sure the Pilate washed his hands and sealed his face. Pleased to meet you, hope you guessed my name. But what's puzzling you is the nature of my game.
Let me talk a little bit about the way that I've categorized the history of philosophy. I learned history of philosophy as most people do, namely that before the modern period, philosophers talked about the nature of everything, God and the world, and justice, truth, beauty, and the kitchen sink. And after maybe Descartes, sometimes Kant, people started worrying that we actually couldn't know the answers to any of those questions with certainty. You get Descartes as the father of modern philosophy because he asked the question, how do I know anything? How do I know that I exist? How do I know that I'm not dreaming all of this? And what you get on the standard view is a bunch of worries about epistemology, the theory of knowledge, how we ever know anything at all, whether we know it through reason, whether we know it through our senses, until Kant comes along, says, well, we know things partly through our senses, partly through reason, but we never really know things as they are in themselves, or reality as it is in itself, and that's the way the world is. So since Kant, so the old story goes, philosophers talk not about real subjects, but talk about knowledge and how we know things, namely epistemology. Now, this struck me as a weird and also quite boring, and also, I have to say, at this point in my life, rather decadent view of philosophy. There are people who have indeed spent their lives asking whether or not existence is a dream. This is a question that may be interesting, it seems to me, if you're taking certain kinds of mind-altering substances. I don't really think it's a question for grown-ups to spend their lives on when the real world presents all kinds of real problems other than theoretically proving its existence. The more that I read about the history of modern philosophy, and the more I started thinking about the problem of evil, the more it seemed clear to me that the reason why people were worried about questions of appearance and reality were not that they were afraid that all of our experiences might not be real, but that actually they were worried that they are. And that the question, is this actually the way the world is, only arises in real time, not when you're stoned or, talking for the sake of talking. It only arises in real time when the way things are seems so different from the way things ought to be that you look for an explanation. So the problem of appearance and reality in philosophy was really an attempt to find some truer, that is, some better reality that explains the appearances and shows that there's something behind them, something that we might get to, something that we might change. The most classic account of this, of course, is in Plato. For Plato, all of the evils that we experience are really just shadows of the real objects, which are ideas. This is a story he tells in the Republic. That's a very classic view. You get it to a certain extent in modern form in Leibniz, who says, well, we don't really know what's going on behind appearances, but if we knew everything, we would know that it's really the best of all possible worlds. So that's one view. And I didn't have a name for those people, or did I? I don't think I did. But I called those people the people who insist that there's some other reality behind or in addition to appearances. So on this one line of thought, I have grouped together a bunch of people who often would have hated each other, but have one thing in common, namely they don't accept that appearances, the way they are now, is the final reality. And what that can mean is anybody from Plato, who spawned a line that goes to Leibniz and certainly Hegel, very straightforwardly, of people who are literally looking for another kind of reality in some sense behind the appearances. Although for Hegel, it's probably just the history itself, okay? So for Hegel, he claims the point is not really the metaphysical reality as it is in Plato or Leibniz. The point is simply that history will present another set of appearances as it goes on, but we do not have to accept the reality of evil and suffering as final. I put Marx in the same tradition, although he wasn't a metaphysician and he would have been furious at being grouped together even with Hegel, much less Leibniz, because he too thinks that reality as we experience it isn't final, that it's going to be deeply, totally overcome through a revolution, and so that the suffering and evil that we now know isn't the last word. Okay? Now, this is a very loose grouping, but I argue it's not any looser than classifying Spinoza and Leibniz together as rationalists who were on opposite ends of all kinds of spectrums, or indeed Hume, Locke, and Berkeley, standardly as empiricists. So on this one axis, you have people who say, no, this isn't final, guys. There's another reality. And on the other end, you have a group of thinkers who say, this is the way the world is. And it's not only wrong, there's something obscene about denying it. There's something obscene about saying the evil and suffering that we experience in the world isn't real. There's something that's betraying the victims of suffering if you say, it's all right, guys, in the best of all possible worlds, you'll see that this doesn't really mean anything. Or in the course of history, you'll find that your sufferings contributed to the greater good of humankind as a whole. People like Bayle, like Voltaire, like Hume in a certain sense, and I argue like the Marquis de Sade as a twist, with a twist, however, say, no, this is what the world is like. Dostoevsky is another figure on that axis who says it's obscene to go behind the appearances. It's obscene to look for another world. And in a very important passage called, it's either called Rebellion, or it's called Rebellion, it's not called The Rebel, called Rebellion in The Brothers Karamazov, he has Ivan say, I don't want to understand, okay? If I understood, I would be accepting the reality of evil, and I've decided to give up understanding rather than to accept evil, okay? So there's the idea something that comes close to the idea that something like understanding itself would be an act of evil because it involves accepting evil. You get that claim in Voltaire, who talks about the Lisbon earthquake. I mean, he wrote a poem about the Lisbon earthquake saying, I'm giving up on philosophy, roughly, because philosophy can't explain to me how babies were shattered on their mother's breasts in the city of Lisbon. They can't explain how this is compatible with a world in which everything turns out all right, or everything happens for the best, or there's a principle of sufficient reason which makes the whole world intelligible. So, on the one hand, you have people who say the world is intelligible if we just work a little harder or find some alternative reality or some future reality. On the other hand, you have people who say, no, There's nothing behind the appearances, and what that means is the world's not intelligible. The problem of evil looks at first glance like a theological problem, and that's how it was formulated at a time when everybody was a theist, essentially. So the question of how we could find meaning or how we could live with horrible evil and suffering was in the first instance a question about how God could permit it to happen. How could a good God permit a world in which children die and earthquakes happen and plagues come, and it looks as if innocent people get knocked out, and often horrible people prosper. Traditional Christians can, even though they have a framework which ought to answer the problem of evil, often stumble on the question, so why, if God knows everything and is perfectly benevolent, why did he create human beings so as to sin at all? The traditional answer was given by St. Augustine, who said, well, God loved human beings so much that he wanted to make them free and dignified, and in order to be free, you have to be really free, and to be really free, you also have to be able to make wrong choices. So this was actually a gift that God gave us to make us in his image, to make us completely autonomous and able to choose, and we blew it. The French philosopher Pierre Bayle had a wonderful analogy, which I think, frankly, rips up that answer. He compares God on this metaphor to being like a mother who allows her daughters to go to a ball knowing that they'll lose their virginity there. And of course, in those days, in the 18th and 17th century, this was, if a girl lost her virginity, she was an outcast, her life was over, nobody would marry her, she had no other options. It's almost a fate worse than death, or for some people, I suppose, a fate worse than death. And Bayle says, well, the mother could say she told her daughters to be careful, and nevertheless, a woman who lets them go to the ball knowing that they'll lose their virginity there loves neither her daughters nor chastity. And I just think it's a brilliant answer to what Augustine called the free will defense of God. And it leaves Christianity with a huge set of questions to answer. Theodicy is a word that was invented by Leibniz, and it meant justifying God. Justifying God, like a lawyer would justify somebody who'd been accused of a crime. And in fact, Pierre Bayle had accused God of a crime, if you will. He had accused God of being responsible for the crimes and misfortunes that make up human history. What you have to understand is that Leibniz makes sense if you start from a classical conception of God, right? If you say that God is omnipotent and God is benevolent, right? God can do anything, he can know everything, then this has to be the best of all possible worlds. And whatever looks to the contrary has got to be the result of our misunderstanding. Right? So it follows from a combination of orthodox religion and logic. Leibniz's whole system follows from that. And it's really quite clear. If you, you can look at it like this. The classical problem of evil is a way of trying to put together three propositions. God is omnipotent, God is benevolent, and evil exists. There's no way in the world to reconcile all three at once, okay? You've got to dump one of them, right? either you can deny that evil exists, and in a certain sense, that's just what Leibniz did. Okay, he says everything that looks like evil isn't really if we know about it. And he gives some very lame examples. He said, well, we wouldn't always want to eat sugar. Sometimes we'd like to eat salt. That's true. And he says, well, if you can't complain if it rains on your picnic or your film, because after all, it's providing a harvest somewhere else. Well, you couldn't see light if you don't have a shadow. All of those are great examples of something, but they're not the examples that actually apply to the problem of evil. If you say to someone who's being tortured, or you say someone who's, experienced a horrible death of someone who shouldn't have died at that time, and you say, well, look, in balance, this was necessary for the best possible of all possible worlds, just like shadow is necessary for light. When the Lisbon earthquake happened, you still had a picture of evil in which evils were on a continuum, so that what they called natural and what they called moral evils were all part of the same family. Of course, they distinguished between, somebody murdering someone and an earthquake or a plague happening. But there was a sense still, first of all, that God was directly in charge of and directly intervening in everything that happened in the world, what was called particular providence. And there was a sense that fundamentally nature was alive. When the Lisbon earthquake happened, it happened at a time in which the Enlightenment was feeling more and more optimistic, and indeed you could say triumphant, about making the entire world intelligible, about there being a reason for everything that we experience, and about our eventually being able to find it. And suddenly you had this calamity, you can call it the first global disaster. It was an earthquake and what we now know was a tsunami right after it, so that you had the complete destruction of what was a major European capital, indeed a major world capital. Lisbon, by the way, never really recovered its international status after the earthquake, although it was rebuilt. You had an international capital no better or worse, and at least as important as London or Paris. And the question was, why was that suddenly destroyed out of the blue? All right, you couldn't think of it as punishment. You couldn't think of it as having a meaning. It was, particularly for people in the middle of the Enlightenment, it was a terrible shock. For old-fashioned theologians, it was, in fact, almost a gift from heaven, because for old-fashioned theologians, they could say, you see, Enlightenment, we can't explain everything. God's ways are mysterious, things happen. The only thing you can do is repent and pray and have faith and worry about the end of the world, which is in fact what they tried to do. But for people who were committed to the idea that the world as a whole is in principle intelligible, Lisbon was a total shock. For Voltaire, who was a deist, that is somebody who believed in God as a creator, but not somebody who intervened in ordinary affairs, but who believed on the basis of the glory of the world as it was created, that there had to be a creator. For Voltaire, because the world was so marvelous and wonderful that as many people believed in the 18th century, science itself proved the glory of God. Now, for Voltaire, when the Lisbon earthquake happened, which was in Europe certainly the major natural disaster since Pompeii, that threw all of that into question. It threw the goodness, the benevolence, the systematicity, the order of creation into question, because if God could produce an event that suddenly wiped out, or not if God could produce it, because Voltaire didn't believe that God had his hand in everything. It was that God had created, and this is the way in which Newton was seen and saw his own work as glorifying God and giving proofs of God's existence. God had produced such a marvelous world that it worked perfectly on its own. And all of the sudden you had this gigantic glitch, as it is in creation. You have a world that seems to be working, and all of a sudden, for no reason, a major city is wiped out in a couple of minutes. For Voltaire, it was a real shock and a real a way of putting not only God on trial, but also philosophy. That's what he wrote in his poem about the Lisbon earthquake, that if you couldn't make sense of why innocent babies were shattered on their mother's breasts, nothing else you could make sense of was important. And so not only was God on trial, but philosophy itself, he wrote in that poem, was empty. And 4 years after the poem on the Lisbon earthquake, he wrote Candide. And essentially the message of Candide is making sense of the world is in some sense being faithless to the victims. And it's being pedantic, it's being idiotic, and it's being without compassion. Right? So that is more or less the bottom line of Voltaire, although one has to say that as a public intellectual, he was very active and became so the older he got. And it's interesting, he may have done, he certainly did more for the world in terms of taking on the causes of people who had been executed unjustly, taking care of their families, trying to have convictions reversed. He certainly did more of that sort of thing, even though he didn't believe that evil was fundamentally comprehensible. He did go to work to try to get rid of some, genuine evils in the world, but it was very piecemeal. What Rousseau wants, of course, is something much more radical. He's imagining, at the least, a transformation of the human being and of human society that's possible, and that would go a long way towards getting rid of not all the evils in the world, but towards recasting the human being altogether. And to do that, of course, you need an explanation of evil. Kant called Rousseau the Newton of the mind, which is a very, very interesting title, because in the 18th century, everybody wanted to be the Newton of the mind. Everybody wanted to be another Newton. And that shows a couple of things. One is Newton was just valorized. He was the hero. He was the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. But also, physics at that point in time wasn't really seen as a separate part of human knowledge in the way that it is now. It was all sort of a continuum. So what was the idea of becoming the Newton of the mind? Well, it was just understanding the world in a marvelous, deep, conceptually changing way, So being able to connect something as apparently unconnected as the moon and the tides, which just seem to be two different spheres. So everybody wanted to come up with another great set of discoveries the way that Newton had. And having dealt with the cosmos, of course, the next thing that people felt ought to be dealt with was the human mind or the human soul. So everyone wanted to be the next Newton. Hume wanted to be the next Newton. He wrote about it quite clearly. And the only person whom Kant ever called the Newton of the mind was Rousseau. It's an extraordinary statement, and as far as I know, nobody succeeded in explaining it until you think about the problem of evil. What was especially important for Kant in calling Rousseau the Newton of the mind were two books that Rousseau wrote. The first was called The Discourse on Natural Inequality, and that book is an attempt to replace the story of the fall in Genesis with a naturalistic version of how human beings were originally and how we got from this original, rather primitive, golden state, not golden, but a fine state, to the mess that we're in now, without telling any stories about eating apples and snakes and things like that. And essentially he describes the descent from this primitive, simple, rather isolated life into the kind of anarchic and often warlike situation that we're in now as a series of mistakes. Right? We don't need evil intention there in particular, we just need a series of mistakes to explain how, well, division of labor looked like a good idea at the time, but in fact it led to people dividing themselves, their interests, their talents, and some people working in rather machine-like ways and other people not working at all. It all seemed like a harmless, efficient, good idea at the time, but this is what happened. Or private property, ownership of land, seemed like it made sense at the time to put a fence around a piece of land and say this is mine, but actually, Rousseau says, of course, it led to all kinds of disastrous inequalities. Now, when he wrote this, Voltaire sent him the only letter that Voltaire ever wrote, and it was about as snide as a letter could be. He said, "I've received, monsieur, your new book against mankind. Rarely has anything made me feel like crawling around on all fours, but unfortunately, since I lost that gait 60 years ago, I'll prefer to remain as I am." Now, Voltaire thereby started a reading of Rousseau, which is completely false, but it was convenient, and a lot of people read him this way, as being primitive and as arguing that we would all be better off in the state of nature and that we actually ought to return to it. This is not actually what Rousseau thought, but when he wrote the book, he didn't have an alternative. So what he's doing is describing a decline of civilization or decline of the human being, and when people wrote to him and asked, well, do you have any suggestions for a cure? He said, you don't call the doctor when the patient's dead. Now, which is a pretty grim view, but 7 years later he wrote the book Emile, which he described as his brightest book and his favorite book. The story goes, by the way, that Kant only interrupted his afternoon walk for two events. Kant lived a very, very regular life. This is what he said was necessary for him to get so much work done. And only twice in his life did he refrain from taking his afternoon walk at the proper time. Once was in 1780, I think it was 1789 when they stormed the Bastille. It was some event in the French Revolution, and that threw him. But some 25 years before that, when he read the Emile, he also sat and couldn't stop reading, and after that the only picture he had in his house was a picture of Rousseau. Okay. Now, what's exciting about this book, this is the book it's the first child-raising manual. It's way before Dr. Spock. It describes how you should raise an infant from birth up until the time that he gets married. What he did, which, again, we all take for granted now, but it was completely revolutionary at the time he did it. What he did was to connect the way children are raised with the way that societies are built. people didn't focus on children, they didn't focus on psychology, they didn't, I mean, it's not entirely true. Of course, you have in Plato discussions of how children should be raised in order to ensure a good state. But in a modern sense, no one had thought about how children are raised, how societies are built, and how the earliest human beings might have been created so as to be not benevolent, good, and kind, which is a misreading of Rousseau that virtually everybody comes up with, but how they were simply amoral. They weren't evil, okay? Human beings were not born in original sin. They were just born without being either immoral or moral in particular, but they have an inborn sense of pity. And if you allow children to develop in natural ways, if you support them in certain kinds of ways, rather than trying to force them into an unnatural kind of narcissism, into seeing themselves in other people's eyes, you could raise whole human beings who were free, self-confident, and not cruel, not vain, and not interested in power. Okay? Now, you'd still have earthquakes. In fact, Rousseau starts with the traditional problem of evil, and he says absolutely nothing of any interest about earthquakes. So you'd still have natural evils. But you would have gone a long way towards curing moral evils and changing both the human beings and the character of society. Again, this is not the idea of radical social engineering. It's not that you would have to completely change people from what they are. It's the idea that we are born fairly blank, not entirely blank, but fairly blank. Just for an example of ways in which he connected things that nobody had thought about connecting. He says, if you read children idiotic fables and you make them sit still and listen to baby talk, and he said a nurse's prattle, what you're training them to, and if you teach them stupid things in school, you're training them to sit still and listen to the idiotic lies of politicians. When Kant says that Rousseau is the Newton of the mind, what he means is that just as Newton showed that where it looked like there was chaos in the cosmos, there turns out to be order and harmony, Rousseau showed that where it looked like there was chaos in the human soul and where it looked as if there was unexplained evil in the world, there was in fact order, and it in fact made sense, and the world truly is the way it ought to be. This is early Kant, of course. Kant. So what does that mean? What it means is that Rousseau was the first person to really confront the problem of evil in all its seriousness, outside of a purely theological framework, and to come up with an explanation of evil that's naturalistic. It doesn't depend on grace, it doesn't depend on a miracle. It says human beings can understand evil. They can understand it because evil is something historical. It didn't come into being in the Garden of Eden. You can explain how it happens in naturalistic terms. And if we can understand how it happened, we have a chance of understanding how to undo it. If there's one thing that philosophers agree on, and they don't agree on much, it's that Kant was the greatest modern philosopher, certainly the most important philosopher since Plato and Aristotle. But they don't agree on why he was so important. In fact, lots of people think that he's important for exactly the wrong reasons because of his theory of knowledge. Now, I think his theory of knowledge was important. I think the idea that you can't prove from the outside that all of this is not a dream, that you can't prove the reality or validity of any of our experiences from outside experience, because our most important ideas, our most important concepts, like the concept of cause or substance, are part of experience themselves. It's a deep and amazing idea, and it's affected the whole way that we perceive the world and talk about perception and everything that's been done ever since. So that was certainly totally important thing that he did, but I don't think they've focused on what was even more important to him. And that's, if I have to focus on one thing, that's the distinction between is and ought. Is has to do with truth, facts about the world, all the things that we know or don't know, can't verify, depends on how. And the ought has to do with the way the world should be. Okay, so what you have here is a distinction between morality, if you like, which is the subject of the ought, and science in the broadest general sense, which is the subject of the is or truth. What people tend to want to do is to reduce one to the other, and indeed life would be easier if we could. Life would be easier if you could say, well, the world really is the way it ought to be. Actually, that's what we want. Or they say, and this is something that Hume did, if we can't find a justification for the ought in the natural world, if we can't prove that things ought to be one way rather than another, then actually the ought doesn't matter very much, or it's just a subjective matter of feeling. And there you get, of course, the short road to relativism. If what we ought to do isn't a matter of truth in the way that, believing that the earth is round or I don't know, the ground is soft because it rained last night. If you can't show moral principles to be true in those kinds of ways, then they don't have the same kind of status. Then they're not real, okay? They're just subjective. And one of the deepest things that Kant did was to show that these are two completely different kinds of discourse. The one has to do with ideas, and the other has to do with facts. And it's crucial for being human and being honest, on the one hand, to realize that these two are separate, and that as much as we want to try to bring them together, we'll never be able to do so. If we could do so, it would be the best of all possible worlds, and that would be a world in which we couldn't actually live in, because there would be essentially everything would stop if the world was as it ought to be. Okay, but the gap between the is and the ought, and the fact that most of what we do with our lives is trying to narrow that gap to some extent. That's what structures human experience, and that, I think, is probably Kant's deepest thought. I mean, he really was truly incredible. He was wrong about all kinds of things, but he came up with so many extraordinary, deep ideas that it's hard to list them all without, doing several courses on it. But if I have to say one thing that I think is really deep and also very, very relevant for the way we live now, it's recognizing the depth and the seriousness of the difference between is and ought. The whole discussion of realism and idealism that you get today, for example, when talking about foreign policy, usually tends to misunderstand or not take seriously enough the distinction between the is and the ought, and the fact that we have to acknowledge the legitimacy of both of them. I used to really hate Hegel. And I hated Hegel because I thought he, through sheer force of will, wanted to close the gap between is and ought that Kant insisted that we keep separate. And I thought of that as being actually rather juvenile. And I had to write about Hegel in the process of writing this book, and I realized I had to understand him better. You can't really write about somebody that you totally dislike or don't respect. And so I had to work my way into how he came to this position, which actually looks rather crazy. That is, that the real is the rational, or the is the ought. He thinks history has a meaning, history has a sense, and it's about the progressive unfolding of human freedom. So what looks like a slaughter bank, as he called it, in history, if you watch it all unfold, you'll see that in fact at the end of history, all of this pain and suffering and evil was necessary in order to produce the free human spirit. And there's been a lot of debate about whether he really said the real is the rational, whether that was a misquote and what he meant by that. But you can't deny that he is trying to overcome this gap that Kant insists is at the heart of the world. Okay? Now, when I thought about it and thought about what you're left with when you think about Kant, it's actually a very, very hard system to live, and it can seem unnecessarily tortuous. It can seem like you're demanding what Nietzsche called a metaphysical wound in the heart of reality. And Hegel wanted to heal. Hegel wanted us to be not just free, but actually happy. What he said is that Kant's morality is, it all sounds very nice, but it's completely ineffective. And what you have is this permanent, if you're a Kantian, you have a permanent sense of frustration. And I understand that. I understand why he thought that a certain kind of metaphysical story in which you could close the gap between is and ought over the course of history. I understand why he felt let's do it. Let's why accept a metaphysics that leaves us in a kind of self-imposed torture? So I had a lot more sympathy for him as time went on, but in the end, not enough. In the end, I think that he is actually trying to, by force of will, deny certain facts that are quite crucial to being human. And I think that Kant is much truer and, in fact, much more modern. Marx said that he was standing Hegel on his head. Marx said Hegel would be all very fine if he were talking about material reality, but in fact he's talking about ideas, and it's all happening in a very abstract sphere. And in fact, that abstract sphere tends to reinforce the existing bourgeois order. Okay? He says what we need is real change. One of his very famous lines from one of his very early writings, the Thesis on Feuerbach, is philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. So what Marx says is when we work, we actually change the world physically. We don't just change it in ideas. We change it very dramatically. And of course, we've taken over a lot of Marx, and he's completely right about that. So his idea was forget about ideological change. What needs to happen is a change in the means of production. And if you actually change the conditions under which people work, you change the conditions of ownership, you will have changed the world and you will have gotten rid of real evil, not just by thinking about it, but by actually doing something about it. Now, in all those ways, Marx was terribly important, terribly progressive, and it's very easy to understand why so many millions of people thought for the first time in history you had a hope of doing something practical through philosophy, but beyond philosophy, to actually rid the world of all kinds of inequalities and evils. The biggest problem, I would say, with Marxism, there are many problems. Of course, there are empirical problems about the ways in which the theory turned out not to predict how history was going to be. But the biggest problem is the same problem that you have with Hegelianism, which is a view that means justify ends, and that history in the end is what solves the problem of evil. So what you have in effect is earlier generations suffering for future generations. And it's one thing if you want to say, I'm going to do certain things, I'm going to take certain, make certain sacrifices for my children's well-being. It's another thing to impose on millions of people a set of sacrifices that you claim are necessary in order to rid the world of certain evils. And that's in effect what happened. That is that an awful lot of people got used as means for a plan that in fact in the end wasn't well enough thought out to overcome the evils that it set out to overcome. It wound up leading to new ones. I find Schopenhauer sometimes easier to take if you look at it as black humor, because some of the things that he says are almost funny. For example, he offers a proof that this is the worst of all possible worlds, and the proof goes like this: any world that was just slightly worse than this one would cease to exist. He mentions the Lisbon earthquake, by the way. He says if you just change things slightly, you would have a series of natural disasters, which, as we know, is true, that could make the Lisbon earthquake look like a small, benign rumble. So if you changed human nature and made us just any more awful than we are, we'd be at each other's throats constantly. So if this world were only a little bit worse than it is, it would cease to exist. Therefore, this is the worst of all possible worlds, which is brilliant in a gallows humor sort of way. But it's a very bleak view to be left with, and actually he thinks that there's no solution. I mean, not only is there no solution to the problem of evil, but that the only possible response to it is to stop willing. Schopenhauer, as you read him, is a real recipe for despair. Okay? But you understand, if you look at where it started, if you looked at, say, Bayle, as a matter of saying, no, I am going to look at things in the face. I'm going to look at the world at its worst. I'm not going to flinch from facts. I'm not going to tell myself any fairy tales about an alternative and better reality or things possibly being better. What Nietzsche does is to say, Schopenhauer is right about there being no alternative reality. And he's right that we have tried to live our lives, most great metaphysics has tried to live our lives as if there were. He includes Christianity, and he has a very powerful critique of Christianity. One of the things he says about Christianity is that it's the Platonism of the masses, and that's what he means. It's trying to come up with an alternative form of reality. What Joe Hill, the great American labor organizer, called pie in the sky when you die, as a way of oppressing people and saying, fine guys, we're suffering now, but later on you're going to burn in hell, and we're going to be eating pie in the sky and the die and looking down at you burning eternally. Nietzsche said we have to stop, and looking at our values in these terms, we have to stop thinking about a different frame of time. We have to stop thinking about a future, even if it's a future in this world, that's going to redeem all the present and past. We have to be able to will the world as a whole, okay, in order to get beyond Schopenhauer, in order to say yes to life as life is. Nietzsche says that hope is the last of the evils in Pandora's box, and what he means by that is that hope is the thing that keeps us tied to a notion of an alternate reality. Hope is the notion that keeps us saying, oh, well, things are going to be better later on, and there's going to be a different form of reality later on. Hope is what keeps us from being grounded and affirming experience just the way it is, because we keep thinking it could be better. Again, I think it's a brilliant and deep idea. I think it's wrong, but I don't think that in the end you can actually argue why it's wrong. I think that you can paint two positions. You can paint a Kantian position and a Nietzschean position, and you can describe what the virtues of each are, and in the end you have to choose between them. But it's a matter of choice. It's not something that you can prove Nietzsche to be wrong. He's too deep for that. For the Western world as a whole, the popularizer of what you might in general terms call a Nietzschean view of the world, or an anti-theodicy, is Freud. Okay, we've all been terribly affected by Freud's idea that, how shall I put this? First of all, that religion is about illusion and wishes, all right? That religion is a product of our wishes for relief from suffering and evil, and it's something that we actually ought to grow up from. This is Freud's view. One of the interesting things that Freud does, which I suppose is also quite like Nietzsche's, he doesn't really distinguish anymore between natural and moral evils. You had this very sharp separation in what I've called the modern period, going from the Lisbon earthquake roughly to Nietzsche, through Nietzsche. But Freud sees no, I mean, it's when he talks about evil and suffering, what he says is suffering caused by other human beings makes us more unhappy because we think of it as superfluous. But he describes them as if it was all sort of one of a kind. And of course, for the infant, it is. He's talking a bit from the infant's perspective. And from that point of view, you know, whether you hit me or whether I get hit by lightning, or whether I'm hungry or whether I'm ill, it's all pain. And it's all pain that suggests, as Freud put it in a wonderful but bleak passage, life is too hard for us. There are all kinds of things that we do to escape from that. He says drugs are excellent, except that they cause risks, but drugs is just a form of escaping from reality. I mean, it's very interesting. He runs through these things with no moralizing. And of course, Freud took a lot of cocaine. He wrote a lot of his early work under the influence of cocaine. It wasn't illegal, he just did it. We can do drugs, but they're risky. He said love is the best thing, but it's very, very rare. He said love is the one most complete way of finding some kind of joy and relief from suffering and evil, and a way of coping with reality. And he said it's so good that anybody who's ever experienced it would never try anything else, but it doesn't happen very often. So he says creative action, creative activity is a way of coping with painful reality. And it's a rather good one because it also has these byproducts that people create things. But essentially, and this I find much more problematic, people create things because they're in pain. It's less of the case that there's you don't see in Freud enough of a description of a human need simply to know, a human need simply to create, that part of being alive in a joyous way is to create. That's Nietzsche. Freud is darker than Nietzsche. Of course, one has to add, he wrote The Interpretation of Dreams in 1905. I'm almost sure, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But he wrote an awful lot of his work after the First World War, and particularly his works that deal with questions of theodicy and deal with the meaning of life and suffering were all written after the First World War. He also had a correspondence with Einstein about war and why there was war and whether there was anything that could be done to stop it. But it's not hard to understand why somebody who saw all of that really very much from not quite the front but almost the front might conclude that there's a death wish, which is something that he concluded, and that there's sort of sheer joy and sheer affirmation of life is pretty hard to find if you're being absolutely honest about what reality is. The year 1945 saw two extraordinary cases of evil. One is the revelations of just how extensive and outrageous the Holocaust was first became known to a general public, and shortly after that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those are two completely different kinds of evil. The philosopher Gunther Anders, who by the way was Hannah Arendt's first husband, wrote an extremely interesting set of books about that. He actually corresponded with one of the pilots who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and who later became mad, most people think as a result of that, though there's a question about what else was going on there. And he came up with a formulation that Auschwitz was probably worse for the individual soul. That is, to be able to be a guard at Auschwitz or to be able to take part in the planning of cold-blooded murdering people close up, where you actually have to see them. It takes a much more hardened and criminal soul, if you like. But he said that Hiroshima is the evil that actually threatens the earth the most. Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil, has been misunderstood, and she was vilified for coming up with that phrase. And it doesn't really matter who came up with it. Later there was a discussion about whether it was she or her husband or Karl Jaspers or who had used the word first, but she certainly used it in the title of her greatest book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. She did not ever mean to say that the evil was banal. It's we who are banal. It's evildoers who are banal. And in describing the character of Adolf Eichmann, she described somebody who was not a demon, not malevolent, neither filled with hatred for Jews nor with lust for killing anybody. In fact, the one time he actually watched a mass murder, he claims that it made him sick, and it probably did. This was somebody who was a bureaucrat and a career man, somebody who was just trying to get ahead, and who was willing literally to walk over corpses in order to do so. She says that half a dozen psychologists examined him in prison and said he was perfectly normal, as one of them said, more normal at any rate than I am after examining him. And that was what was quite so horrible. It would be very nice to be able to imagine that evil is only done by evildoers, by people who we can imagine, if not actually having horns, the sort of creeps that you see in certain kinds of horror movies. I don't know, Silence of the Lambs, or so I don't usually watch that sort of thing, but you can fill in the blanks about particular people. And there are such people in the world. We call them psychopaths because they literally get pleasure out of causing other people pain. There are such people. The problem is that most of the Nazis, even people who joined the Nazi Party, and certainly the people who were fellow travelers, were not like that at all. They were really quite ordinary people who were put in extraordinary circumstances and simply didn't want to rock any boats. What Kant says is that we always have the possibility of being free, all right? We don't ever know what we're going to do in a situation when we're put to the test, either commit an injustice or die. He gives an example that I like very much because I think all of us can understand it. He says, supposing you take a man who's says he can't resist temptation every time he goes past a certain house. And this is the way the 18th century put it. They were more discreet than we are. What he meant was a whorehouse. Or do you want me to say brothel on film? Okay. He says, this man says he can't resist temptation every time he walks by a whorehouse. And Kant says, well, okay, but if you put up a gallows right in front of the whorehouse in which he was going to be hung the minute he comes out of it, he would find that he could resist temptation very well because, in fact, no desire is stronger than the desire to be alive. If you take the same person and you ask him to write a letter lying and saying that an innocent person has, in fact, committed a crime, and that unless he signs this letter, he himself will die, Kant says none of us know what we'd do in a situation like that, but all of us know that, in fact, we could refuse to sign the letter even if it means our death. And all of us know that we ought to do that, even if we know that we'd be wimps, in fact. Okay? And what that means, Kant said, is each of us know for ourselves that we're free. Right? And it's only in these life and death situations where you know that there's no ulterior motive, that you actually feel the reality of human freedom. I think it's a very important claim for thinking about why people risk their lives today. I don't think it's necessarily nihilistic at all. I think it's in order to prove their own freedom. I think they do. It's an idiotic and unnecessary way to do it, but I think until we understand that, we won't understand a lot about terrorism. But that's perhaps a different subject. Arendt said that watching her old friends and acquaintances and colleagues during the Nazi period exactly proved this. That is, you could not predict, from having known people before, from having known anything about them, from having known their profession, from what they did in the past, you could not predict who would join the Nazis or go along with them and who would actually stand up. She said it was a surprise of her life. Okay? And that's what human freedom means. Kant says, not only do we not know it of anybody else, we don't know it of ourselves when it comes to the clinch, whether we would actually have the courage and the will to be a hero in a situation like that. One of the results of the Lisbon earthquake is that a separation between human beings and the natural world, which was of course already underway. I don't mean to say that one event marked a modern period. It was already underway, but a separation became more or less fixed at that point. The only way that you had to solve the problem of evil or to respond to the problem of evil in reaction to something like this was to say, you know what? The world has no intention. The natural world has no meaning in itself. The source of meaning and intention, the source of meaning is in intention. So you had a separation after that between natural evil, which suddenly just became suffering or disaster, and moral evil. And evil, the way of understanding evil began to be more clearly, well, evil is something that's done with evil intention, all right? In order for something to be evil, it has to be done with malice, it has to be done with desire, it has to be done with a certain amount of clarity about the goal. And this is, of course, something that only human beings can do. Rocks can't do it, plagues can't do it, tidal waves can't do it. It's only something that can be done by human beings. At the time, it seemed like a very modern, scientific way of distinguishing tyrants, right? Things that tyrants do from things that, lightning or earthquakes or volcanoes do. And that actually had a certain amount of practical significance. Tyrants are something you can do something against, and we can think about political philosophy, we can think about economic theory. Earthquakes and plagues may be something you can do something about too, but it's purely in the realm of science. You don't have to worry about giving it a meaning. So what you had for a good nearly 150 years was a notion of evil that stayed somewhat fixed, not entirely, but somewhat fixed. Evil was something that people did to other people. They did it with evil intention, and it was as close to solving a philosophical problem as philosophical problems ever get. I think that the modern ended with the First World War and the realization that an enormous amount of evil, and up until then an inconceivable amount of evil, had been done by people whose intentions were merely bad. They weren't particularly malicious. It's interesting. The people who planned and executed the First World War blundered into it. They were greedy, they were negligent, but they certainly weren't malicious. They certainly didn't have a plan that you would want to describe as evil in the way that the Nazis did, for example. They certainly weren't into plunder and pillage and raping in the way that, I don't know, Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun were. So what you had, however, was a carnage unlike anything that the world had ever known. You had a real end of the old order, and it had been done simply by people who hadn't known what they were doing. Hadn't understood what it meant to have modern technology, for instance, hadn't understood that you can't send cavalry against heavy artillery. Eichmann in Jerusalem was written as a piece for The New Yorker, and for that reason an awful lot of people don't consider it philosophy. I think it's one of the deepest philosophical books of the 20th century, and it's deep because in a way that Arendt herself didn't even realize, she's questioning a view about evil and evil intention that was beginning to break down in the 20th century, but that nobody had formulated until she did so. We talked about until the First World War, but more clearly the Second World War, the modern was characterized by identifying evil actions with evil intentions. And that was a way of distinguishing between moral evil and natural evil, so that you had the view that something couldn't be evil unless it was done with evil intentions. This is why we no longer refer to earthquakes and plagues as evils. Okay, or if we do, we're using very archaic language. We talk about them as catastrophes or disasters or suffering, but we don't talk about them as evils. And that's only because of the concept of intention, because after the Lisbon earthquake, the only thing that could be evil were things that had intention. Okay, now it seemed like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't very well thought out, because of course people commit all kinds of evil actions without evil intentions. And that's really what Arendt showed at the Eichmann trial, is that his intentions were bad or mediocre. That is, he was willing to literally murder people in the interest of getting ahead in his career, but that's different than wanting to murder people for the sake of murder. Arendt, and that's in a sense what talking about the banality of evil means. Now, both the prosecutor and the defense were still in the grip of a picture that we're still in the grip of, namely that it can't really be evil unless it has an evil intention, so that if you deny somebody has evil intentions, you must be denying that they're evil, and then you're excusing them. Okay? So what the prosecutor tried to do all along was to show that Eichmann was a horrible, malicious, hateful anti-Semite who just really wanted nothing more with his life than to kill Jews. And what the defense attorney tried to do was to keep saying, well, no, his intentions were really quite ordinary, and he was just following orders, and he was doing this and that. And in fact, Arendt says the defense attorney was completely right. But what's at issue is not his intentions, it's what he did, and what he did was evil, even if his intentions were perfectly banal and ordinary. Leibniz was at the beginning of a line which tries to understand the problem of evil and tries to answer the problem of evil by saying, yeah, we see these appearances of evil, but behind them, if we understood more about how the way the world works, we'd see that they really weren't quite evil at all. Now, Hannah Arendt would never have said that. She would have been outraged at anybody who did say that. But I call Eichmann in Theodicy, Eichmann in Jerusalem a theodicy, because I think there's a sense in which she is in that line, and I'll tell you why. She thinks that if you can explain evil as something that's not mysterious, that's not demonic, but actually, I mean, what does banal mean? Banal means ordinary. It means commonplace. It means something that you can explain. If you can explain the occurrence of evil, there isn't a horrible mystery at the heart of the cosmos, so to speak. There's something that we can do something about. If evil is about thoughtlessness, which is another thing that she says in that book and in a later work called Thinking, then by thinking more and thinking properly, we could actually do away with some of the evil in the world. And it was by thinking about Eichmann in Jerusalem in those terms that I realized you could solve a lot of the problems that people have had with Eichmann in Jerusalem, ways in which they've found it intelligible, and ways in which make clear what Mary McCarthy said. Mary McCarthy was a very close friend of Arendt's, and she wrote in a defense of Eichmann in Jerusalem. Arendt was horribly attacked for it, and she still is to this day. A lot of people who had been lifelong friends broke with her over that book because they said that what she was doing was excusing the criminal. She wasn't excusing him, she was trying to understand him. And McCarthy wrote in a wonderful piece called The Hue and the Cry, said, when I finished reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, I felt exhilarated in the way that I feel listening to The End of Figaro or The Messiah, two works that are about redemption. Now you think about that and you think, wow, how can that be the case, because I felt, and Arendt wrote back, don't tell anybody, but you're the only one who really understood me. And since writing that book, I've felt an immense sense of relief. Now, what could that mean? The only thing it seems to me that it could mean is that the book is not an attempt to exonerate Eichmann in the sense of a theodicy, but the world as a whole. It's saying the world as a whole is not fundamentally foul and corrupt because there are crimes like Eichmann's and there are crimes like the Holocaust. If we can understand it, the world as a whole is redeemed. If evil were truly incomprehensible, if evil were truly unintelligible, you would have a black hole at the heart of the world, it seems to me. You would have a sense that there's something crucial, not some little thing that we can't understand, but one of the things that affects humankind the most, that can't be explained. That's a fatal flaw in the universe, a fatal flaw in creation, and a fatal flaw in us, right? That is the sense that it's all mysterious. It could break out at any time. You're looking at somebody who looks ordinary, and in fact he's a monster. And the world as a whole is a terrifying place that it's very, very hard to say yes to. And so that's the threat of the Holocaust, I think. And what Arendt did in that book was to say, look, evil's comprehensible. And if evil is something that we can understand, then actually we're not fundamentally flawed beings. We may be weak, but we're not living in original sin. We don't need a miracle to save us. We could just possibly save ourselves if we worked at it hard enough. And that means that the world is, as she says in the most beautiful passage in that book, the world is a place fit for human habitation. I think it's very important for all of us who are critical of Bush and critical of his response to 9/11 and critical of his abuse of 9/11, that we don't go so far overboard as to deny that 9/11 was evil. I think the reason that terrorism is evil is this one. Distinguishing between what happens to innocent people and what happens to guilty people is the fundamental moral principle. This is what human beings do. We want good things to happen to good people and bad things to happen to bad people. We want virtue to be rewarded, and we want vice or evilness to be punished in some way. We can disagree about the scope of the punishment, we can disagree about the kind of reward, but every time we feel that if some just person has been killed or lives a miserable life, and we say, that's horrible, that's not fair, every time some scoundrel gets away with goes scot-free after committing crimes and gets a nice job in a right-wing think tank, we feel there's something manifestly unjust about the world when that happens. So we may disagree about the scope of the punishment, but the idea that human beings distinguish between the innocent and the guilty is something like the basic moral principle, okay? Now, earthquakes don't. That's the difference between earthquakes and human beings, all right? Earthquakes and floods and lightning strike the just and the unjust alike, and it makes no distinctions. But human beings make distinctions. Just people make distinctions. When terrorists simply seek to kill as many people as possible without any regard to what they did, they're not only killing innocent people, they're overturning the fundamental moral principle, right? And they're trying to imitate nature at its worst. And I think that's the reason why we were all so horrified by 9/11 and indeed by any act of terrorism, but 9/11 was so visually overpowering and struck so clearly at the symbols of power, the Pentagon and Wall Street, that our initial reaction, this is evil, was an absolutely right one. Unfortunately, we could have had the world on our side, and we certainly could have destroyed Al-Qaeda by now, had we acted in concert with the other nations who felt that what had been done on September 11th was indeed evil and felt tremendous sympathy with the United States. We couldn't have done it by saying we had a mission to rid the world of evil. This is not how evil works. As we talked earlier, you don't want me to say that. This is not how evil works. We talked a bit about psychopathology and evil, and the idea that a small percentage of the crimes in the world really are committed by people who simply take sheer pleasure in other people's pain. But in fact, the terrorists are not like that at all. The terrorists, on the other hand, I wouldn't call the terrorists banal in the same way that Eichmann was, but they are deeply committed to a series of ideals. And if we don't realize that and acknowledge that, we have absolutely no chance of undercutting that. The ideals may be wrong, but they're ideals that are as powerful as the ideals that send a young man or woman today to go and fight in Iraq. When I first published Evil in Modern Thought, it got a lot of press, particularly in Europe, which is where I live, and I was being interviewed all the time because it was during the run-up to the war in Iraq, and I was a very strong opponent of going to war, and I did a lot of speaking on that subject. And I was constantly worried that somebody was going to ask me whether I thought Bush was evil. It seemed to me that at that point in history and that point politically, that saying, yes, he's evil, would be simply adding to the polemics. It would be simply mudslinging of the simplistic and demonizing variety that he himself was engaged in, and that would be a politically useless thing to say, extremely unhelpful and extremely polarizing. And when I speak in public, the only reason for doing so seems to me to be politically useful. On the other hand, I didn't want to mince words because I was horrified at the preparations for war. But nobody asked me that question. It was really interesting. 5 years later, I have absolutely no qualms about calling the policies of this administration evil. Whether George W. Bush or Donald Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney or any of those people are evil is not a matter for me to know, because that would involve knowing something about the inside of their souls that I don't know, and I don't even know about myself. So I think that it's probably wrong ever to speak about particular people as being evil, but it is certainly right to speak about particular actions being evil. I think the war in Iraq is evil. I think it was undertaken for terrible reasons. It is having terrible consequences, and I think that particular things that happened within the war are evil. But let me step back a moment to give you another instance of evil that got a tiny bit of attention when it came out, but has curiously fallen out of the discussion, and I think it's important that we remember it. A few days after 9/11, George W. Bush said to his budget office manager, "Lucky me, I won the trifecta." Now, you may not know what trifecta is. I didn't know what a trifecta was until I heard about this. A trifecta is a certain kind of bet that you can make in a horse race. If you bet on 3 horses and you say 1, 2, 3, they're going to come in like this, and they come in the way that you bet on them, you've won the trifecta. It's like hitting the jackpot, okay? It's the best thing that can happen to you in horse racing. Now, why did Bush say that? Well, he claims to have said that because in discussing before he became president whether or not there were circumstances in which he would leave the national budget unbalanced, he said, well, it'll always be balanced, except in a case of war, recession, or national disaster. Okay? And a few days after 9/11, he was saying, lucky me, I've won the trifecta. Now, this is actually important because, as we know, we have a very unbalanced budget because of his tax cuts for the rich. Clinton left office with a surplus. We have an enormous deficit between the war in Iraq and the tax cuts for the wealthy. And he said, lucky me, I won the trifecta. If it had been a one-time clumsy remark, if it had been something that he said in private, you might think, well, this guy has a sick sense of black humor, but black humor is, after all, a form of humor. You might think that. What he did, though, was to go and repeat that phrase 13 times that I have counted in front of Republican audiences, mostly at fundraising dinners, getting laughs every time. Now, you have to remember that he first said this at a time when the ruins of the World Trade Center were still smoking. People were still hoping to find, if not actually their relatives, at least their relatives' body parts. The nation was in mourning. And this was a person who was trying to change the world by appealing to 9/11 and the tragedy of 9/11 and the lessons of 9/11, which we're still hearing as justification for everything from doing away with civil rights, certainly civil rights of prisoners, to starting wars in places that had nothing to do with him. And yet he was saying to other audiences, oh boy, this is just exactly what I wanted. This is my lucky day. Now, I think that's an instance of evil, actually. It's amazingly, it was reported. A few people were outraged, and it disappeared. I don't think that the problem of evil has a solution, and I think it's a great mistake to try to solve it, because if you try to solve it, you wind up sounding like Leibniz. You wind up sounding as if you're justifying evil, and that isn't something that you want to do. On the other hand, I think these are questions that all of us ask ourselves at some point in our lives, and that drowning them out is no good either. So I think philosophy can help us think about this in a historical perspective. It can help us think about things more clearly. It can help us think about the differences between the kinds of evils that we run into and what we might do about each of them. Because there are things that we can do. And if we abuse evil by talking about, wiping out evil and wiping out the evildoers and, let's go get them and gun them down or bomb them down or, kill ourselves in a jihad to get rid of the evildoers, we've seen the real evil to which that kind of unreflected talk about evil can lead. Unreflected talk about evil, and it will come up, is extremely dangerous, and that's something that we've seen in the past years. So I do think that philosophy can teach us to take this part of experience, to look at, to analyze different forms of evil, to look at things that we can do in minimizing it, to look at ways in which the world can be changed, to look at ways in which the world has been changed in the recent past, to look at things that we thought were normal, or that people thought were normal, a really fairly short time ago and realized that actually things that seemed like fixed pieces of the world were recognized as evils. I'm thinking about slavery, I'm thinking about racism, I'm thinking about torture until Gonzalez and crew came along. Things that had been abolished, that had earlier been part of practice. I'm thinking about sexism. I mean, when I was a girl, I didn't think about, women having the kinds of opportunities that women have now all over the West. It wasn't a part of discussion when I was growing up. And my daughters and son live in a very different world than I grew up in. That's one generation. There's an awful lot of progress that's been made. I emphasize progress because it's so common and so trendy to talk about the way the world has gotten worse. The problem is that people have been doing that for about 4,000 years. There are ways in which the world has gotten worse. I don't want to deny that. But there are also very clear ways in which it's gotten better, and it's important to remember those cases so that we don't despair, so that we don't lose hope, that we can look at some signs and say, you know what, progress is possible in my lifetime. And I think when you think about the case of Eichmann, and you think about not even Eichmann himself, but the people who drove the trains, the people who manufactured Cyclone B, all of them much more banal than Eichmann himself, the Holocaust couldn't have been carried out without very small acts of evil by people who were acting as part of a machine in ways that they should have stopped and thought about what they were doing. And goodness works exactly the same way. There will be heroes in the world, Martin Luther King's, Gandhi's, these larger than life characters who affect millions and millions of people. But I very much like the slogan, think globally, act locally. And if all of us do that, we'll be able to keep, as Arendt said, the planet a place that's fit for human habitation. I think philosophy is something actually that all of us do naturally until the grown-ups tell us to stop. I think every child is a born philosopher. Every child tends to ask the question why, pushing the answer further and further back until her parents or her teachers say something like, well, just because the world is that way, because they don't know how to answer the last question. A smart child will say, so why is the world that way? The only answer that any child would actually be satisfied with is the answer, because it's the best of all possible worlds. I believe that that is the natural end of human reason. Okay? I think that everything that we do when we use reason is aiming at the best of all possible worlds. It's either aiming at whether, how the world works, how to figure out, why things work the way they are, why the universe is structured the way they are. And if something's wrong, it's focused on trying to change it. How can I change it? How can I make things better? Now, the interesting thing is, if this were the best of all possible worlds, there'd be no scope for human creativity, and there certainly would be no need for philosophy, because nobody would ever ask why, right? were the best of all possible worlds, why would you ask a question about it? You'd simply bask in it. So we have a really funny and interesting tension, and I think this was in some ways Kant's greatest contribution to modern thought, is to say we're striving for something, we're actually striving for an ideal that if we were to recognize it, it would actually take away from most of what it means to be human. So I believe that everybody starts doing philosophy in rather simple ways. Every question, why the world is the way it is, why is there evil, why is there suffering, how do I live my life, what's justice, why do bad things happen to good people and the other way around. All those are philosophical questions that occur in ordinary life, and they occur very naturally, again, until somebody says, shut up, kid, and do something more practical. The thing is that philosophy is and can be practical because I take one of philosophy's most important contributions to enlarge our understanding of what's possible. We tend to accept a lot of the world as being fixed and given. We tend to assume that things were always the way they are now without really much thinking about how drastically they've changed. And I don't just mean things like the internet, as important as technological change has been, but real conceptual changes in our way of thinking about, again, these great and important concepts: evil, justice, truth, beauty. All of those things have changed radically over time, and they could change again, and we could do better than we're doing now. The first step to making any change in the world is asking yourself whether something is necessary. Take slavery, right? Slavery was an institution for thousands of years, not everywhere, and there were different concepts of slavery, and the very idea of slavery changed radically in the time that it was allowed. But from ancient times, as far as it's recorded, until 150 years ago in this country, one of the later countries, one has to say, in the West to abolish slavery, that was assumed that that was the way the world was. It was very rare that anybody actually questioned conceptually, is this a just way to arrange the world? You took those kinds of relations for granted until you consider what it means. You make statements, we hold these truths to be self-evident, an extraordinary claim, by the way. We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. This is, of course, manifestly a lie. It's not a truth, right? All men are not created equal. All men and women aren't created equal. There are all kinds of differences between us. And moreover, the time that Jefferson wrote that, he was owning slaves. So it's an extraordinary statement because it's actually not about the way the world is, but it's a statement about the way the world ought to be. All right? Very, very important distinction. But and Jefferson and all of the framers of the Constitution thought of themselves in part as philosophers. They all read philosophy, they talked about philosophy, they wrote philosophy. They were very educated men. Until you ask those kinds of questions, you can't begin to change anything. So I don't think that the world would be a better place if everybody became a professional philosopher. I think that's a sort of silly conception. But I think that all of us would be better off for studying some philosophy because it's simply an extension of what we normally do when we use our own heads to think something out. Evil is a word that's appropriate to use. I think literally when you have a kind of visceral reaction, your mouth drops open. You think, this has crossed a line somewhere. This ought not to have happened because it changes our relation to the world. it is a feeling that the ground is dropped out from under your feet, that the framework and the rules by which you use to decide what's good and bad are suddenly shifted, and suddenly you actually don't know how to function in your world where that can happen. That line should never have been crossed. And now that it's been crossed, it's always a possibility again. The problem of evil looks at first glance like a theological problem. So the question of how we could find meaning or how we could live with horrible evil and suffering was in the first instance a question about how God could permit it to happen. Now, for Voltaire, when the Lisbon earthquake happened, it threw the goodness, the benevolence, the systematicity, the order of creation into question, because God had produced such a marvelous world that it worked perfectly on its own. And all of a sudden you had this gigantic glitch, as it is in creation. You have a world that seems to be working, and all of a sudden, for no reason, a major city is wiped out in a couple of minutes. The year 1945 saw two extraordinary cases of evil. One is the revelation of just how extensive and outrageous the Holocaust was first became known to a general public, and shortly after that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those are two completely different kinds of evil. Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil, has been misunderstood, and she was vilified for coming up with that phrase. She did not ever mean to say that the evil was banal. It's we who are banal. It's evildoers who are banal. And in describing the character of Adolf Eichmann, she described somebody who was not a demon, not malevolent, neither filled with hatred for Jews, nor with lust for killing anybody. In fact, at one time he actually watched a mass murder. He claims that it made him sick, and it probably did. This was somebody who was a bureaucrat and a career man, somebody who was just trying to get ahead, and who was willing literally to walk over corpses in order to do so. She thinks that if you can explain evil as something that's not mysterious, that's not demonic, but actually, I mean, what does banal mean? Banal means ordinary, it means commonplace, it means something that you can explain. If you can explain the occurrence of evil, there isn't a horrible mystery at the heart of the cosmos, so to speak. There's something that we can do something about. If evil were truly incomprehensible, if evil were truly unintelligible, you would have a black hole at the heart of the world, it seems to me. You would have a sense that there's something crucial, not some little thing that we can't understand, but one of the things that affects humankind the most, that can't be explained. That's a fatal flaw in the universe, a fatal flaw in creation, and a fatal flaw in us, right? That is the sense that it's all mysterious, it could break out at any time. You know, you're looking at somebody who looks ordinary, and in fact he's a monster, and the world as a whole is a terrifying place that it's very, very hard to say yes to. And so that's the threat of the Holocaust, I think. And what Arendt did in that book was to say, look, evil's comprehensible. And if evil is something that we can understand, then actually we're not fundamentally flawed beings. We may be weak, but we're not living in original sin. We don't need a miracle to save us. We could just possibly save ourselves if we worked at it hard enough. And that means that the world is, as she says in the most beautiful passage in that book, the world is a place fit for human habitation.